Okay, hi there. This is Dr. Loyola again. This is the third in our 3-video series on distant reading. And in this video, we're just going to go through the tool that you're going to be using to perform your own distant reading analyses of Frankenstein for your distant reading report. I'm going to talk a little bit about that report at the end of this video, but first I just want to make sure that everyone's feeling comfortable working in the tool suite. So we're going to spend the majority of this video time just going through that interface, showing you how to put text in there and what the different graphs can do. So to be clear, the word that I'm using is here on your screen, Voyant. And that is a free open source suite of tools that will run automatic analysis of texts, looking for patterns, word frequencies, frequencies across time within the text, and so on, and produce something like 25 or 30 different visualizations to help scholars or researchers see through the text in different ways, right, and see different patterns. So it's basically a free distant reading tool that we're going to use to analyze Frankenstein in this class. And that is going to be, as I said, your big distant reading report, which is the main assignment for this particular unit. And I do want to just be completely clear that my original plan for this was that you all would choose your own text to distant read. But with the move to a completely remote and online space where we're not going to get to check in periodically in class, originally you had a full week just to work on your distant reading in the lab on campus. So because of that, we are going to just all work with one text, a text that I know really well, and that is Frankenstein, just to try and help ease some of that burden. So, and also I'm hoping that maybe some of you have read Frankenstein as well, because it does, sometimes distant reading can be a bit easier if you have at least some familiarity with the text. So if you haven't read Frankenstein, you don't have to for this assignment, though certainly you can. But I do want to be clear, that's in no way required. But if you want to look up like a Wikipedia summary or a SparkNotes or one of the many movie versions that exist, that would work just as well, right? So you could have a good sense of what the story is before you go into these graphs totally blind. All right, so to get started with Voyant, the first thing that we want to do is actually collect and prepare your data, right? And in this case, that data is, of course, the text Frankenstein. So I'm now going to turn away from the slideshow and navigate, walk you through the steps to collecting and preparing your data. Okay, so the first thing that you want to do is where are we going to get this text? And for this class, we are going to use Project Gutenberg, which is available at the URL that's on your screen, gutenberg.org. When you navigate there, it should look something like this. And Project Gutenberg, as you can see from this homepage, is a free and open source repository of thousands of texts that are within public domain. And public domain means that they're not in copyright anymore. So we haven't spent any time in this class talking about copyright and stuff like that, though certainly that's a big topic for DH. But just so that you know, things don't get to keep copyright forever. They do every year. There's a new kind of release of texts that reopen up to public domain. And Project Gutenberg collects a lot of those texts. So there's tons and tons of stuff on here. You can see right here that on their homepage, they boast over 60,000 free ebooks. And you can get tons of different versions of each book from here. So once you're at Project Gutenberg, we're going to search for Frankenstein. Right, and we're just going to grab this first one at the top. All of these are correct, any of these three. We want to make sure it's by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. And it just looks like they have multiple versions for some reason. So we'll just grab this top one. So once we've found Frankenstein, we're going to open the plain text version of the text, right? And that's going to be the text that doesn't have any additional metadata, any additional content. It's just raw textual data. So here you can see we have an HTML file, EPUB with images, EPUB with no images, Kindle, and here finally at the bottom is our plain text version. So when we click on that, that's going to open us up to a very unstylized, literally plain text version of this book, right? And it's not even, we don't even have any alignment or anything, right? So it's pretty, would not make a great reading experience, but it's going to make a great distant reading experience. So once we have our plain text version open, we want to identify specifically which data we want to analyze. So one thing that you probably know but maybe haven't thought about with regards to books is that there's a lot of text in there that isn't actually the story itself, right? There's introductions, prefaces, copyright information. Project Gutenberg has some like legal content, and we don't really want to capture any of that because that's not the text we're reading, right? We're interested in just Frankenstein. So since we're interested in just Frankenstein, we want to make sure that that's the data that we capture. So if we look through this, here, right, we don't really need any of this use information. We don't need this title, metadata. So we can kind of scroll through. Here's our table of contents. We don't need that. And here is the start of the text. And that is with letter 1 to Mrs. Saville, England. Okay, so we're going to start from there and basically just do a nice long copy here. Okay, and then we can go pretty fast till we get to the bottom, but then we want to make sure that we don't get any of the other content at the end. So you see that there's a very small little tag right here that says end of this Project Gutenberg ebook, and that's where we actually want to stop our data collection right here at the end of the text with the final line, he was soon borne away by the waves and lost in darkness and distance. So there's a bunch of stuff again at the bottom that we don't want to capture because that is our, or not our, but Project Gutenberg's legal content and all of their use contracts and so on. So we're just going to copy that. And then we're going to go to voyanttools.org and paste the text right into the box for Voyant. And I'm going to walk through all those steps here right now. Right, so Voyant is going to look like this. So once we've copied that text, we're going to navigate to voyant-tools.org. And from this landing page, we're just going to do the super chill, easy way and paste it right into this text box. You can see there's multiple ways to add. You could add full folders and files of text because, again, remember, distant reading is often done at a huge scale. We're scaling this down significantly for our class, right? But normally you would have hundreds, if not thousands, of documents. And so it does have those kinds of capabilities. So once we've pasted our text in, we'll click Reveal. And that's going to take us to our main interface. Okay, so here we are at Voyant. And so I'm just going to walk you through each of these graphs that are the default graphs that show up on the interface. I'm also going to walk you through ways that you can change these graphs and the ways that the graphs are related to one another. Okay, so we'll start at the top left here with Cirrus. And this one should look relatively familiar. It's your standard word cloud, right? So of course, in this case, words, the size references their frequency, right? So the bigger the word, the more frequently it appears. And this is a great space, as I think you probably will see from both the Lord of the Rings project and from the practice assignment that I have you all doing, that this is actually a really great place to start just for getting a sense of what raw words regularly appear, which might indicate things like major characters, major themes, possibly even tone or setting, right? So for instance, if London appears all the time, then we can assume that a text takes place in London or is at the very least really concerned with London, right? So in this case, we might notice this word Elizabeth showing up really prominently. And that from there, we can relatively easily guess that Elizabeth is a major character of some sort. Right? So that's our word cloud. And you can adjust how many words appear by scrolling this little thing down here. So you can see we started at 35 and we can get all the way up to 500. It's going to rearrange, very small, but you can pop it out of this particular box to make it bigger. So you can get the most frequently used 500 words or as few as the most frequently used 25 words, right? So that's a great thing to note for zooming in and out of what's going on this particular text, right? And again, that's just raw word counting. Okay, so this middle one that we have up here at the top, this is the reader. And so this will give you down here along this purple bar is effectively a progress bar. And this is where you can read the text in its entirety. You can also, you'll notice that you can hover over each word, and that'll give you an indication of how many times that word appears in the text, right? So we can see here that beauty appears 27 times. And we may or may not think that that's a significant number of times, right? We might want to do something like look back to how many pages are in Frankenstein, and then that might tell us something like, okay, so beauty appears on like a tenth of every page, right? Like, or 10% of the pages, right? Or something like that. And that might give us some kind of information about how frequent it is relative to other words, right? Because we do want to make sure that when we're thinking about frequency in this kind of raw data information here, right, that we're not just taking, like, say, the number 34 and saying, wow, that's a huge number, that's really important. We want to make sure that we're keeping it relative to other words, right? And so that's something that the word cloud helps us see immediately, right, is that these texts are sized relative to others, so we can see, right, that man is more important or more frequently used than, for instance, friend, right? Okay, so as we scroll through, you'll notice that the bottom scroll also moves, and we can also navigate the text through that bottom scroll. My internet's just being slow right now. See, there it goes. Okay, so that is our reader, which gives you a little bit more than just raw reading, as it gives you this number when you hover over a word, right? But one thing that you might find interesting to do is maybe to think about where something like regret shows up 7 times, right? And we can just click on that. And you'll notice now that everything has kind of changed, right? So this graph over here changed, this stuff down here changed. And just in case you didn't see that, we'll just go on and refresh the page. And now this is the page as it defaults without any kind of intervention from me. So once again, you'll notice we've got a bunch of different stuff going on, and I'm just gonna click a word, we'll say welfare. And notice that this graph has changed, this down here has changed, and suddenly we have these 2 peaks here along our frequency point, right? So this tells us where we see welfare appears 2 times, and now we can see relatively where in the text welfare shows up, right? So right here at the beginning, and then somewhere here, I don't know, about 80% of the way through, right? And you'll see that that's reflected here in this graph a bit as well. Okay, so refreshing the page again to start from that fresh page, let's look at this next graph, this one up in your top right. This is a trends graph, and this is one of the more powerful graphs once you kind of play with it enough to figure out how to use it effectively. So you'll notice that this one maps words against one another with frequency over the course of the document, right? So in this particular case, we have eyes, father, life, man, and shall mapped with relative frequency over the whole document as broken into 10 pieces, right? So giving you a little bit of a percentage marker, right, for where in the document things are. So I'm not sure in this particular case what kinds of things we might draw from this, but some things that immediately show up, right, are these peaks of life and man, and then shall. And it is a little bit interesting to think of a word like shall having a peak relative to some of these other words, like, I mean, almost any other word, that we might expect to show up more often than shall, right? Because shall is just a statement of purpose, or a statement of, like, I'm going to do something. So that right there is something that's maybe interesting to note. What does it mean that we have these peaks and valleys of this text shall that suggest that somebody is promising to do something, and who knows if they ever actually do it, right? Like, what does it mean that there's this constant pushing forward and promising towards the future that may or may not ever get resolved, right? That might tell us something about this, the tone of this text, or the theme of this text, or some of the concerns of this text. All right, then down on the bottom, this summary chart down here in the bottom left gives you an overall count of everything we're looking at. So this tells us that we have 1 document in the corpus, and we know that that's the 1 document Frankenstein that we pasted in there. There are 75,199 total words, 7,071 unique word forms, right? And you'll notice here that you can hover over that text, and it will give you a brief definition of what a unique word form is, right? So multiple occurrences of words like the are counted once. So that's interesting to note, right? Because that tells us that total words are 75,000, but only 10% of those are unique, right? So sometimes it's just the same word repeated again. And I'm not sure what you can make of that, but that's an interesting piece of data to hold on to, right? And then we've got vocabulary density, words per sentence, right? So sentences are about 22 words long. And then the most frequent words listed again here, man, life, father, eyes, shall. So those words should sound familiar because they are the same words that you'll notice were graphed on our trends chart, right? So just to keep in mind that the default information that Voyant presents you are mapping the most frequent things relative to one another, right? So again, it's perhaps worth questioning, why is shall so important? Or eyes, like what is so important about the eyes in this particular text? And what can we do with eyes as a particular body part or as a particular space that we can't do with other things? What kind of poetic meaning or poetic information can we take from that? Right, so that's another great example of how, even though we are distant reading, it's not that we're being completely separate from the text at all, and it's not that we're doing away with that typical English class practice of like reading deeply into texts and questioning choices. It's rather that we're doing it kind of in a different way, right? And we're doing it to hypothesize through close reading and distant reading together. Okay, and then this graph down in the bottom right is our context graph. And this is one that's used a ton in linguistics. And it tends to not be a fan favorite in digital humanities and DCD200. So what this one gives us is a term in the middle that is our primary term. So in this case, we're looking at the term man. And then it tells us the 5 words to the left and 5 words to the right of that text most often as it occurs, right? So this is not a word that I know that I necessarily think we could get much from, but if we had a smaller word, right, something like rejoice, which we'll click over here and produce here, now you can see that rejoice appears one time, and when it does, this is roughly the context in which it appears. So this at its best gives you a way to get brief snippets of context rather than just kind of dealing with loose, floating, decontextualized words with nothing to know about them, right? So some ways that you might find this useful, if you think back to the Lord of the Rings video, right? One of the words that we talked about was light and dark, right? And how those words can indicate tone and they can indicate emotion, but they can also simply indicate time of day, right? Or setting. So this context graph would be a place that you might look to see how often light appears in context about setting, or how often it appears in context about emotion, right? And again, the close reading poetic license parts of English would say that that isn't necessarily as important to make that separation, but for distant reading, which is based in empirical demonstrations of things, we would want to focus on that, right? Like we would want to be able to say, oh no, it's 80% of the time light is used to indicate emotion, not setting. And be able to make some kind of stronger claim that something was a lighthearted text. So these are the 5 graphs that appear here. And I'm going to stop talking to you about graphs now and just walk you through a few other things on this interface that you may want to make note of for doing your own distant reading analyses and reports. All right, so first of all, you'll see up here that you've got terms, links, these other options. And these are different graphs that you can toggle simply by clicking on them. So if we click on links, you'll see that that creates this different links graph. Now, I'm not as familiar with what this is, and probably you aren't either. So if you want to know what your graph is you're looking at, which, spoiler alert, you do, that was distant reading number 1, right? We want to look back over this help icon, and that will show us what it is that we're looking at. Right, so it will explain to us what it is we're seeing so we can have a sense of like critically and intelligently reading our data. Okay, another option that we have is this pop-out option, right? And so this is actually how I got you those direct URLs that you used for your participation assignment. So for your distant reading reports, one thing that you are going to have to do is include snapshots of the graphs so you can talk about them. And you'll want to use this pop-out option to do that. Okay, and then the final thing that I want to point out to you all before we turn back to the assignment itself is, again, the way that all these graphs interact with one another. So let's say that you really like the cirrus graph, right? Like you find word clouds to be really effective and really nice to read. So maybe you want to look at something more deeply for this word happiness, right? We see it shows up 49 times. But where does it show up in the text, or under what context does it show up? So if we click on that, you'll see that all the rest of our graphs change to indicate that, except for this one should have done that too. Collocate should have. So we can, since it's not responding, we can actually stick happiness right in the search bar, and now we have our context graph that also matches the others. So now we're simply looking at the word happiness, right? And you'll notice that once we clicked this and got all our graphs up to date, that now we have this map of the word happiness over the course of the entire text down here. And we also have this trends map showing us that happiness seems to be a rising emotion, right? So again, I'm not sure what you want to make of that. I'm not going to draw your hypotheses and conclusions for you here, but that's an interesting thing to look at, right? That it looks like we have this kind of falling happiness with these little peaks, but that ultimately on the end, it seems to get really high and then again fall, but that ultimately even that fall is still higher than where we started, right? And you can make of that what you will. But that is just a few ways that you can use Voyant and see how all the different graphs are connected to one another, and you can explore your text using these visualizations. Okay, so before I let you all go for this evening, I just want to say a few things really quickly about the distant reading report that you're going to be doing, right? And of course, you'll have a full assignment sheet with all this written down and all the specs coming later this week, but I just want to give you a few prompts of ways that you might start using Voyant specifically with this report in mind. Okay, so first thing is that we are going to all be working with Frankenstein. So that is the text that if you are following along with this tutorial video, you should already have loaded into Voyant and already ready to be exploring and playing with a bit. So just continue with that for the distant reading report. Okay, so explore the graphs and visualizations and think about hypothesizing what they might be telling you about the text, right? So what kinds of things can you identify about characters? What kinds of things can you say about themes, tone, overall kind of narrative or character arcs, right? Anything at all. And especially use that distance over the those graphs that show you how things change over the course of the entire book, right? To think about what an arc might look like, right? So remember that arcs can rise, they can fall. Your basic kind of plot narrative arc can just arc, right? But you want to think about like what's happening there by looking at these kinds of graphs. So some things to start with for doing specific and targeted searching and things that might uncover some interesting information in these particular areas. So first, you will probably recall that the word man was one of those most frequently used terms. And, you know, for better or worse, in this particular text, man is often used simply as a short form for human. So one thing that would be worth searching is terms that signal humanity, right? And of course, terms that signal a lack of humanity. So things like man, woman, compared to things like monster, creature, monstrous, right, and things like that, unhuman, and so on. Other terms you might look at are family terms. So again, we saw that father was a pretty big prominent term here. What other kinds of terms are there that indicate family connection, right? Sister, wife, brother, friend, and so on, right? Any kinds of broad relationship terms. Then, of course, with any text, you always want to look for gender terms, partly because those are really easy to see because we have really clear gendered language, right? So pronouns, specific nouns that only apply to women versus men, right? So like wife versus husband, sister versus brother, things like that. So how does gender play out in this text would be another interesting thing that you might look at. And then because one thing that you do want to look at is tone, you can always search words related to emotion. So I already demonstrated some of that with searching on happiness, but what are some other emotion-based words that you can maybe pull out of that giant cirrus cloud and then use that to help guide your emotional reading and your emotional critique of this particular text? And then finally, because I've read this text many times and know what it's about, I would also recommend that you look at words related to life and death, right? So living versus dying, things that, and that would include words like animate, like, to be able to move, or graveyard, or yeah, I'll leave it at that. But any kinds of words that in some way signal or relate to life in the living and death in the dying. And then finally, character names, of course. Once you can figure out who your main characters are, you can always search on those names. And I will give you a general reminder one time that Frankenstein is not the creature's name, it is the scientist's name. But the scientist is definitely the monster. Okay, so as you collect this info, make sure that you're saving your graphs, right? So that is going to be something that you will need to include in your reports. You can screenshot them or you can pull out those individual URLs. It's entirely up to you, but make sure that you have a local, constant and discrete file that saves these graphs. Okay, and then ultimately where we're going with this is that you will write a report using at least 3 graphs to make hypotheses about this text, right? So very similar to what you did in the practice assignment earlier in this particular unit, right? You're going to be taking these and then demonstrating how you can read from the graph, what kinds of information you can pull from the graph, and what kinds of hypotheses you can make about this text based on that graph. Okay, and then as I mentioned at the start of this, there's more on this to come in the full assignment sheet, which you can look for later this week. And of course, I'll send an announcement when that is posted. All right, so that wraps us up. This closes out our distant reading lecture series, and I do hope that you're feeling a little bit more focused and secure in what this particular assignment is going to require of you. Again, really embrace that spirit of exploration. I know this is tricky. It's a weird way to think about books and a weird way to think about text, but Voyant is actually like a really fun interface, and I can't say enough about just exploring it, clicking on things, see what you see. And at the very least, you can just start by describing the graph, describing what's on the page, and hopefully that description will lead to some insight. Okay, so I will be holding another round of drop-in office hours on Friday when you can catch me. Otherwise, I will talk to you all via email or other avenues online, and I hope you all continue to take care of yourselves.